Welcome to our module on late adulthood. Before you watch this video, write down all of the words or phrases that you can think of to describe aging and older adults and all of the quote-unquote facts that you know about them. Take a moment and pause the video to do this. Now, look over your list carefully. As we go through these 3 videos on the physical, cognitive, and psychosocial changes that occur during late adulthood, keep track of whether your descriptions are correct. We'll begin this chapter by looking at what late adulthood is, and we'll also be looking at some important demographic information. We'll also be looking at the characteristics of the aging population and terms such as lifespan and life expectancy. In terms of physical development, we'll look at some different theories of aging, the physical and sensory changes that are experienced in late adulthood. We'll also be looking at sleep and sexuality. We'll also be exploring cognitive development, and specifically we'll be looking at memory, intelligence, Alzheimer's disease, and compensation. And we'll also be exploring psychosocial development. We'll look at stereotypes, integrity versus despair, relationships, and living arrangements. By the end of this section, and after having read the section in your textbook on demographic information related to late adulthood, you should be able to describe the increase in the number of individuals who are currently identified as late adults. You should also be able to describe the increase in late adulthood worldwide. You should be able to explain gender and ethnic differences in the number of individuals identified as late adults. And you should be able to explain the different ways that developmental psychologists describe aging. You should also be able to explain the difference between lifespan and life expectancy and define the 3 age categories for late adulthood. You should also be able to explain what factors contribute to becoming a centenarian. Studying late adulthood is important for all of us for many different reasons. One important reason is because adults who are age 65 and over are the fastest growing segment of the US population. Also, a current 65-year-old can expect to live 19 more years. This is a significant change since the 1950s. So here in the 1950s, we would have expected a person to only live about 13 and a half years after the age of 65. Also, because we see such a significant shift in the overall population and an increase in the number of older people living in our population, this is going to affect work. It's going to affect healthcare, housing, social security, caregiving, and adaptive technologies. As Table 9.1 in your textbook points out, there's been a dramatic shift or dramatic increase in the population of people who are ages 65 and over. If we look at people in 2012, the rate or the percentage of people who were over 65 was 13.7%. It's projected that by 2030, that percentage will be 20.3%. And of course, this will have a significant effect on those things that I just mentioned, including social security, housing, the need for adaptive technologies, and social security. You can also see that there's going to be an increase by the year 2030 in the percentage of people who are living beyond the age of 85. So this is an interesting chart for us to reflect on as we think about the different needs that we will have within our society and the different expenses that we're going to incur as a society. It's also exciting for us to think about this because many of us have parents or grandparents who are in this age group, and it's wonderful to think about how people who are in this segment of the population are going to be able to be living longer so that we can enjoy their company for many more years than we would have been able to in the past. Older people are a rapidly growing proportion of the world's population. People are living longer, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is living healthier. This increase in the aging population presents many opportunities, but it also presents many public health challenges that each country will have to prepare for. And the percentage of people who are ages 65 and up is going to vary by country. And your textbook provides a table, Table 9.2, that points out the percentage of citizens ages 65 and older in 6 developed countries. And I think it's very interesting to note that by the year 2050, it's projected that 40% of Japan's population is going to be over the age of 65. So some of those issues that we just reflected on that are related to this increased aging population are going to be of significant, even greater significant importance in Japan than they would be, for example, in the United States. You also note too that Germany is not far behind at 30%, and Italy also at 31%, and Russia at 26%. So there are going to be these increasing demands on the overall system, meaning the overall economy for people, for meeting the needs of people who are ages 65 and over. And again, these relate back to, in our country, Social Security. When we think about other countries, we could think about their retirement system. We could think also about healthcare, and we could also think about a lot of different occupational areas that we're going to see a significant increase in growth. There are two important terms that we need to know in our study of human development. One is life expectancy and the other is lifespan. These two terms are often used interchangeably, but they have very different meanings. Lifespan is the greatest age reached by any member of a given population or species. Life expectancy is the number of years a person is expected to live from a specific starting point. Your life expectancy changes as you grow older and as you face different risks. So think about this. Many infants and young children in the United States used to die from infections. High infant and child mortality kept life expectancy low well into the 20th century. But once people passed through those vulnerable years, life expectancy was much higher. So for example, the life expectancy for a female born in 1900 was about 48 years of age. But if she reached the age of 20, her life expectancy was over 60. And at age 40, her life expectancy was nearly 70. Sometimes when we tell kids that the life expectancy in 1900 was 48, they think that that means that at age 48, people were old and decrepit, instead of understanding that 48 is an average, and that high infant mortality brought that average way down. As you noted from the last slide, overall, women do have a higher life expectancy than men, although, like I had mentioned, we do see women lagging behind other countries when we think about women in the United States and their life expectancy increases over the past few decades versus those of other developed countries. When we see men and women, if we look at their overall life expectancy, though, we typically see that in each country, women tend to live longer, that they have a higher life expectancy. And there are a variety of reasons for this. One is better immune functioning and lower rates of mental illness. Also, estrogen seems to have a protective factor or effect on the circulatory system. And then women tend to have better health. As you can see here, life expectancy varies by race and ethnicity in the United States. There are three main determinants of life expectancy that impact this gap. These include economic circumstances, medical and behavioral issues, and geographic and environmental conditions. Let's take a moment to think about the impact of economic circumstances. Researchers suggest that 80% of the life expectancy between Black and white men could be attributed to socioeconomic factors. Several of the states with the lowest life expectancies, like Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, are also some of the states with the highest poverty rates. And those who live in poverty often have less access to education, healthcare, nutritional food, housing, and other factors which can help to lead to better health outcomes and affect life expectancy. Let's now think about behavioral issues. What behavioral factors do you think might contribute to the higher life expectancy seen among Asian Americans? Some important factors are related to diet, which among Asian Americans is more likely to include fish rather than red meat. Both white and Black Americans tend to eat more red meat and less fish, And we know that high consumption of red meat can contribute to high cholesterol and therefore an increased risk of heart disease, which we know is one of the leading causes of death among whites and blacks. Often when we think about aging, we think about retirement and late adulthood as a homogeneous age period. So in other words, we may think of everyone who is over the age of 65 as being about the same. But actually, gerontologists, they like to classify old age into 3 periods, as is described in your textbook. And we can think about this as the period of 65 to 84, and this is considered young old, and people in this period are in generally good health. They are socially engaged and they have healthy or good cognitive functioning. And then we have what is called the oldest old, and this is from ages 85 to 99, and people in this group have increased health problems and increased care needs. And then we have the centenarians who are over 100, and these individuals are often in good health until their 90s, and then there may be a rapid terminal decline close to death. Let's now take a look at physical development in late adulthood. And by the end of this section, you should be able to describe the different theories of aging and describe the changes in physical appearance in late adulthood, describe the sensory changes in late adulthood, also describe the chronic health conditions and the importance of nutrition and exercise in late adulthood. You should also be able to describe the physical and functional changes in the brain during late adulthood and explain what happens in Parkinson's disease. You should also be able to explain how sleep patterns change in late adulthood and how sexuality changes in late adulthood. So why do we age? What is it that causes these changes that we're going to be exploring that happen throughout our lives and become even more evident in late adulthood? Well, modern biological theories of aging in humans currently fall into 2 main categories: programmed and damage or error theories. And the program theories imply that aging follows a biological timetable. And this is regulated by changes in gene expression that affect the systems that are responsible for maintenance, repair, and defense responses in our body. And then damage or error theories, which we'll be looking at in just a few moments, emphasize environmental assaults to living organisms that induce cumulative damage at various levels as the cause of aging. So we could really think of these 2 theories or approaches to thinking about aging as programmed and non-programmed. So programmed is what we're going to be looking at now, and then non-programmed would be those, the explanation that we age because of damage or because of environmental assaults to us that really results in cumulative damage at different levels of our of us as human beings, and that this is what is causing aging. So overall, we can think about how program theories follow a biological timetable. And program longevity considers aging to be the result of a sequential switching on and off of certain genes, with senescence or aging being defined as the time when age-associated deficits are manifested. And we also have cellular clock theory, and this suggests that cells lose their ability to reproduce. We also have declines in immune system functioning, and we might think of this as immunological theory. And this states that the immune system is programmed to decline over time, and this then leads to an increased vulnerability to infectious diseases, and thus aging and death. And then we have hormonal stress theory, and this suggests that the hypothalamus isn't working as effectively, and this then leads to metabolic problems. So our biological clocks act through hormones to control the pace of aging. Let's take a closer look at cellular clock theory. In this theory, cells are limited in the number of times that they can reproduce to repair damage. And It's theorized that telomeres, they shorten each time a cell reproduces. Now, telomeres are the caps that are on the end of the chromosome, and when they become too short, they lose their ability to repair damage, which results in aging that we see in human beings. We may also see that the cell may die, or we may see that the cell will continue to divide and become abnormal, like what we see in cancer. Another theory of aging centers around the immune system, and it focuses on metabolic stress. So we have an innate immune system. We have our skin, mucous membranes, cough reflex, stomach acid, and specialized cells that alert our body of an impending threat. And with age, these cells lose their ability to communicate. We also have an adaptive immune system, which includes our tonsils and spleen and bone marrow, thymus, and our circulatory system and the lymphatic system. And these all work to produce and transport T cells. And with age, we produce fewer T cells. The empirical evidence that is related to cellular clock theory is the Hayflick limit. So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a researcher named Leonard Hayflick. Some of you may have heard of the Hayflick limit because of Leonard Hayflick's influence in our understanding of how cells divide. In particular, Hayflick, or Leonard Hayflick, he noted that cells that were grown in cultures, they reproduce by dividing, and that they make copies of themselves, and that this is what you all learned about earlier this semester and in other classes. This is the process that's known as mitosis. He noted that there's a finite number of times before the process stops for good, and the cell may die. So he also noted, too, that cells go through different phases. And the first phase is healthy cell division. And then the second phase is where we see mitosis slowing down. And then we have senescence. And this is where cells stop dividing entirely. And they remain alive for a time after they stop dividing, but sometime after cellular division ends, cells do something in particular that's rather disturbing. They commit suicide. They end their own lives. So that once a cell reaches the end of its lifespan, it undergoes a programmed cellular death that is noted in your textbook, which is apoptosis. So this is very interesting because the implications of this Hayflick limit suggest that the moment that we are born, we have this molecular clock that is winding down and leading us eventually to that state of senescence, or moving us towards death. I think what's interesting to note too is that when all of the cells that are created in the human body before birth and all the cells that these cells produce are multiplied by the average time it takes for cells to reach the end of their lives, you get about 120 years. And this is right around that range that we talked about when we talked about lifespan. Let's take a closer look at the hormonal stress theory of aging. You might also hear this known as the neuroendocrine theory of aging. And this theory suggests that it's because the hypothalamus doesn't regulate hormones as well that we see aging happening. And because of the hypothalamus having this reduced ability to regulate hormones, there can be an excess of a stress hormone that you've learned about in, I'm sure, other classes, known as cortisol. And as many of you know, when we experience stress, we experience higher levels of cortisol. But even if we're not experiencing stress, if our hypothalamus isn't regulating hormones well in the way that they did when we were younger, we may have higher levels of stress hormones. And we're also going to see, in addition, as we get older, some other hormonal changes. We know that we might see changes in insulin and thyroid hormones. We also may see changes in norepinephrine and in epinephrine in particular in people who are very old. And these hormonal changes are related to increased development of diabetes, thyroid problems, osteoporosis, and orthostatic hypotension. And for those of you who don't know, orthostatic hypotension, it describes a fall in blood pressure that a person experiences when they stand up, and they might feel dizzy or lightheaded. And this then can be an indicator of other much more serious health issues. So when we think about aging, we have what are called programmed theories and non-programmed theories. We just took a look at programmed theories of aging. Let's now take a look at non-programmed theories of aging that are related to damage or errors in our DNA. And so overall, these theories suggest that DNA damage can happen because of increased age and exposure to harmful agents, including, for example, UV radiation and hydrocarbons. Now, when some of you think of hydrocarbons, you might think of gasoline or kerosene, but there are many products that we are exposed to or that we use that contain hydrocarbons. And over time, regular exposure to hydrocarbons could result in some harmful consequences to our bodies. So, for example, hydrocarbons are in even some baby products and in hair and bath oils and sunscreens and in makeup removers. You also will find hydrocarbons in many cleaning products. You'll also find them in many automotive products in addition to gasoline. So in gasoline additives or in fuel injection cleaners. And these are just a few of the places where we might see hydrocarbons. And so when we're regularly exposed to hydrocarbons or we have frequent exposure, this then can affect this, it can affect our DNA. Now, short-term acute exposure can have much more immediate and very devastating effects. So if, let's say, a child were to consume one of these, let's say that they, a child, drinks, or like you remember a few years ago where they had these Tide Pods and they were worried about kids eating those. And I'm not sure if Tide Pods contains hydrocarbons, but I'm just thinking about, these short-term acute exposures to things that can be very harmful. That's what we typically think of when we think about the potential negative consequences of products that we use. But also the potential negative consequences may be very, very gradual so that we don't even notice that we're experiencing any of these negative consequences. And over time, our DNA is affected. And ultimately, DNA damage can contribute to aging indirectly. We can think about, cellular senescence, that, where the cell dies, or we can think, or we might think about a direct effect of some of these things that we might be exposed to, where we may see cellular dysfunction, which then can increase our risk for certain diseases. Also related to this non-programmed approach to thinking about aging is damage to mitochondria. And this is when there's damage to mitochondria, then there is less generation of energy for the cell, and this then can lead to cell death. Let's take a look at free radical theory. When I think of the phrase free radical, I think about all of the products that are available to supposedly reduce the effects of aging. And most of these products are marketed to women, and they are skincare products that are supposed to reduce wrinkles or improve elasticity of the skin. So some of you may have heard of free radicals. So let's take a look at this free radical theory of aging. Now, this was a theory that was developed back in the 1950s. And you may know what a free radical is, and this is a molecule that has a free electron, and this property makes it react with healthy molecules in a destructive way. So because the free radical molecule has an extra electron, it then creates an extra negative charge. And then this then causes unbalanced energy, making the free radical bind itself to another balanced molecule as it tries to steal electrons. And so this balanced molecule becomes unbalanced, and then it becomes a free radical itself. So you see it's this, almost like a snowball process. And it's known that diet, lifestyle, drugs like tobacco and alcohol, radiation, all of these can accelerate free radical production within the body. And then this may cause damage in the cells and tissues, like cancer and cataracts. There are many physical changes that occur as we age. For example, the heart muscles thicken and the arteries become less flexible. Lung capacity diminishes and the kidneys become less efficient in removing waste. The bladder also loses its ability to store urine, and neurons lose some functioning, but new ones are produced. There's a lot of variability between people, and genetics, lifestyle, and disease all play a role. As we move into late adulthood, we start to see more evidence of changes in body shape and composition. As you'll remember from your readings earlier, after age 30, people tend to lose lean tissue, and this then reduces the amount of water in our bodies. Also, as we age, bones will lose some minerals and become less dense. Now, osteopenia is when our bones are weaker than normal, but not so far gone that they break easily. And this would be, if they're breaking easily, the hallmark of osteoporosis. Our bones are usually at their densest when we're at age 30, and osteopenia, if it does happen at all, it's not inevitable for everyone, it usually happens after age 50. And this age depends upon how strong our bones are when we're young, and if we, if our bones are naturally dense, for example, then you may not ever develop this. But if they're not, you may develop osteopenia earlier. So osteopenia, and then seeing it turn into osteoporosis is not inevitable. People who are in late adulthood can make adjustments to their diet. They can increase exercise. Specifically, strength training can be very helpful, and sometimes medication can help to keep their bones strong and dense for many years. Also, we see an increase in body fat, and this actually begins to happen after age 50. Now, of course, it can happen sooner, but this is a natural change in our body composition. And older individuals may have almost 30% more fat than when they were younger. And the fat tissue builds up towards the center of the body, including around the internal organs. And then this can increase one's risk of having significant health issues. We know that when someone has a lot of fat in their core area, in the abdominal area, or visceral fat, but more specifically in overall the abdominal area, when they have a large waist, this can increase their risk for certain cancers, especially those that are related to hormones, and then also can increase one's risk for heart disease and diabetes or pre-diabetes, like and insulin resistance. Also, we see changes in skin and hair. Most of you are aware of these changes. We know that the skin becomes thinner, less elastic, it's losing fat. It doesn't look as plump and smooth. The veins and bones are seen more easily. Scratches and cuts can take longer to heal. A person who is in late adulthood is likely to bruise more easily. They are also more likely to have age spots, wrinkles, and dryness. And there's also an increased risk of skin cancer. So this means it's of particular importance for people in this age group to have regular annual visits to their dermatologist. If they don't have any skin issues, annual is a great approach. But if they do have skin issues, if they've had skin cancer, then they need to be visiting more frequently. Or if they have any abnormalities, then it's going to be important for them to schedule an appointment with their dermatologist because they're more likely to have developed skin cancer. Also, this aging can be heavily influenced by skin exposure. And we see that at this point, the hair follicles stop producing new hairs, and there's continued graying due to a loss of pigment. As we get older and move into late adulthood and through late adulthood, we are likely to experience a loss of muscle tissue. That's a natural part of aging. In other words, we're likely to experience sarcopenia. And people who've been physically active they're likely to lose less. So this again goes back to that investment in your body and being healthy for a longer period of time and starting an exercise routine or regimen earlier in your life so that later on you experience less of the detrimental effects of aging that many may experience. So some of the reasons that we see these changes in muscles can be because of a reduction in nerve cells that are responsible for signaling muscles to move, also a decreased ability to turn protein into energy, and then inadequate calories or protein to sustain muscle mass. And these changes in muscles can lead to weakness and a loss of stamina and mobility. And it also can increase an individual's risk of being frail, and they're more likely to fall and to have fractures. There are things that people who are in late adulthood can do to really almost treat the effects of these changes in their muscle tissue. And the main treatment path is exercise. And in particular, resistance training is very beneficial for people who have that loss of muscle tissue. And ultimately, what it's designed to do is to improve their muscle strength and to improve their stamina. Also, this resistance training can have additional benefits that can help a person as they're moving into late adulthood and through late adulthood. In particular, resistance training can help balance hormone levels and can help to turn protein into energy for older people. So there are some significant benefits to resistance training that even go outside of increasing muscle tissue. For some people, they may, seek out hormone replacement therapy. I do want to point out, though, that hormone replacement therapy, as many of you know and have read, is debated because it increases one's risk of some cancers. But it is thought that this type of therapy can raise a person's lean body mass and decrease their abdominal fat and help to have a positive effect on hormone levels that women experience during menopause. But again, there can be some very significant negative consequences for using hormone replacement therapy. So using more natural approaches might be better, like the resistance training. And then there are also some natural supplements that women may decide to use as well under the supervision of their doctor, of course. As we get older too, and many of you probably have noticed this with your parents or your grandparents, there are also changes in height. And height loss is related to changes in bones and muscles and joints. And people typically lose about 1/2 inch every 10 years after age 40. And overall, they generally lose about 1 to 3 inches total. There are also changes in weight where men will often gain weight until about age 55, and women will usually gain weight until they're about 65. And late life weight loss occurs because fat replaces lean muscle tissue. Some of the sensory changes that are experienced in late adulthood are specifically related to vision. And some of these include cataracts, macular degeneration, and glaucoma. When a person has cataracts, they experience a clouding of the lens of the eye. And with macular degeneration, this is where the center of the retina deteriorates and there is then a loss of central vision. And if you'll remember, perhaps from other classes that you've taken, the retina contains visual receptor cells. And so if the retina is deteriorating, then it would make sense then that there would be a loss of central vision, especially since this is happening at the center of the retina. And then another is glaucoma, and this is where there's a fluid buildup in the eye that damages the optic nerve, and this can lead to a loss of peripheral vision. In your textbook, you'll see some examples of some of the vision changes in aging. And this slide presents for you what normal vision looks like and then what cataracts would look like. So if a person had cataracts, this is what that same image would look like. And then with macular degeneration, you can see that the central vision, the center of the visual field, is what is obscured. And then with glaucoma, you see that the peripheral area of the visual field is what is affected. Another sensory change that many older adults experience is hearing loss. And a hearing loss is a sudden or gradual decrease in how well a person can hear. For many people who are in late adulthood, this loss happens gradually over time. It's one of the most common conditions affecting older and elderly adults. About 25% of adults aged 65 to 74 have disabling hearing loss, and about half of adults who are age 75 and older have hearing loss. Having trouble hearing, of course, can make it hard for people to understand and follow a doctor's advice, to respond to warnings, to hear doorbells and alarms. It can also make it difficult to enjoy talking with friends and family, so there can be social implications. So there can be a really overall significant psychological effect that one experiences when they have hearing loss. Also, as people move into late adulthood, they're at an increased risk of experiencing tinnitus, and this can be very distressing to individuals, where they have a ringing, hissing, or roaring sound in the ears. And then also, they're at an increased risk for balance problems that are caused by a decline in the inner ear functioning. As people age, they experience some changes in their ability to taste and smell. There's a gradual loss of taste buds that begins in the 50s. And because this is gradual, it's usually not very noticeable. And then there's also a loss of smell due to aging. And this produces most of the changes that are experienced in the sense of taste, since taste and smell are what contribute to flavor. And this is also due to a decrease in olfactory receptor neurons. So some of these changes can be due to natural aging, but sometimes they could indicate other neurological conditions, which is why it's important that people, as they age, have regular doctor visits and get regular checkups. Also, the quality of diet can have an effect on one's ability to taste and smell as they age. In late adulthood, there are also reduced or changed sensations in touch, in particular related to vibrations and temperature and pressure, and this can then lead to an increased risk of injury. In late adulthood, people are also likely to experience some chronic pain. And as your textbook points out, about 60 to 75% of people in this age group report some type of chronic pain. I think it's also important to note too that overall, in general, older adults are less sensitive to pain. That doesn't mean that this is in conflict with the experience of chronic pain. Perhaps if they were not experiencing less sensitivity, that chronic pain might be even more intense than it would otherwise be since they're in late adulthood. So as older adults tend to experience less sensitivity to pain, this can conceal conditions that are requiring medical attention. Also, pain can produce a cycle of disability. So a person might have pain, which then reduces activity, and then because they're not using their muscles and joints, when they do engage in that activity, they experience more pain. So we can see this cycle that can develop. Also, pain, because it can be so debilitating for people, can contribute to weight gain and sleep problems and depression. A person may not be as likely to get out and get exercise. They might find it difficult to sleep because of the discomfort that they're having. And then also it may lead to feelings of depression because of the feelings of not being able to feel in control of the pain that they have. Also because when you're not getting adequate sleep, this can affect mood and well-being. When you're not able to get outside and engage in that regular physical activity that you may have been used to engaging in, this also can contribute to some depression, especially because it may increase some individuals' risks of being more isolated. And we know how important social experiences are throughout the lifespan. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has a series of suggestions for people at different stages of life related to the types of foods and the quantities of these foods that they should be consuming. So for older adults, they should be consuming fruits and vegetables, grains, and protein-rich foods, but at certain rates, so that half of their diet's from fruits and vegetables, 25% from grains, and 25% from protein-rich foods. One of the issues faced by older adults is that because of sensory changes, they may not experience the same pleasure when they eat as they used to. Also, because older adults they're likely to experience a reduced sensitivity to taste, they may overuse salt and overuse sugar, which can exacerbate already existing health conditions like hypertension and diabetes. I would encourage each of you to visit choosemyplate.gov for specific information related to nutritional guidelines. These nutritional guidelines provided on this website are not just related to older adults. They actually have guidelines for different stages of life, and there's a lot of additional helpful information. Older adults are also more likely to experience chronic conditions, and these are ongoing, generally incurable illnesses that affect daily life and require continuing medical attention. And of course, as you've noted in your readings, the prevalence of chronic conditions increases with age and is also more common in older women. On table 9.6, you'll find a table of the different chronic conditions commonly experienced during older adulthood. And you'll note that high cholesterol and hypertension and arthritis are the top 3 chronic conditions experienced among this age group. Age is one of the greatest risk factors for developing cancer. And actually, 60% of people who have cancer are 65 or older, and so are 60% of cancer survivors. So for people who are older adults who have cancer, they are not alone. This is a very common experience of people during this time of life. One of the challenges of cancer during this time of life is something called comorbidity. And this means that people who are diagnosed with cancer may also have additional health problems. Some of these health problems are those that are more commonly experienced during later adulthood, like high blood pressure and heart disease, lung disease, diabetes, kidney disease, and arthritis. And when a person has these coexisting conditions, this can then affect treatment as well. I want to point out too that there are some additional factors that can affect treatment during this time of life. For late adults, or people in late adulthood, I should say, the effectiveness of medication can be affected by the decline in organ functioning, so that what might work for a younger person may not work well for an older person. Also, chemotherapy compromises cognitive functioning, and this can be especially challenging for older adults who already have some cognitive declines because of other things going on related to aging. Also, treatment may be really hard on the older adult's body. In addition, there can be an increased prevalence and risk of malnutrition and environmental injury. And then two, there's also an increased risk of depression that is associated with decreased survival rates among people in late adulthood who are diagnosed with cancer. And this is also true for people in earlier stages of life who are diagnosed with cancer. They're also at an increased risk of developing depression, but this is just something important to point out that is also experienced in late adulthood. Heart disease is one of the most common health conditions among men and women in the US, and the risk of heart disease tends to increase as a person ages. Most of the risk associated with heart disease, though, is related to lifestyle factors or disease and not because of natural aging. So there are things that people can do to decrease their risk of heart disease. And all of these fall under a category of living a heart-healthy lifestyle earlier in life. And that can include things like a healthy diet, eating lean proteins, or eating foods that are rich in omega-3s, eating leafy greens and other vegetables, and eating berries and other fruits, and having low-fat dairy and whole grains. Getting good sleep is also important. Minimizing stress levels, exercising regularly. This can be a particular difficulty as one moves into late adulthood, but earlier in one's life, these are things that we can each do to decrease our risk later on of developing heart disease. And then too, it's important as people get older for them to be able to monitor their heart health at home. And we're seeing more and more technology available that allows older adults to do this. Some of these include technology that's been around for a long time, like just a regular blood pressure monitor, but we might also see some apps too that can be very helpful. And I think many of you probably know older people who, although we might think of older people as being fairly removed from technology, they actually can be really good at using technology. And there are many different assistive technologies that allow older adults to use these apps. So they can be very helpful. Another health concern experienced in late adulthood is osteoarthritis. Now, this can also be experienced during middle adulthood, but the risk goes up as a person gets older. And this is because the cartilage at the joints naturally begins to thin as people age. I want to point out, though, that it's not only people in middle or late adulthood who can have osteoarthritis. A person who plays a lot of sports and maybe has had repeated injuries that have affected their joints, perhaps like a knee injury, they can also experience osteoarthritis. In middle age, this is when we see it affecting women more so than men, and this can be due to hormonal changes which can affect the bones. But by age 70, most people of both sexes have some symptoms of this condition. And this severe osteoarthritis is actually a major contributor to disability around the world. I recently read that the prevalence of osteoarthritis has continued to increase. And if we look back at 1940 and we compare the rates then to today, we've actually experienced a doubling of the rates of osteoarthritis. Now, the research does suggest that longer lifespans, and of course, as many of you could imagine, higher rates of obesity could be contributing partially to this. But it's also, I think, important to note that the research suggests that this is not fully explaining why we're seeing such a dramatic increase in osteoarthritis. What scientists think is that there may be some other features of modern life that they've yet to identify that might be involved in the development of this condition. As people get older, they experience an increase in risk of developing osteoporosis. And with this, their bones can become very fragile and break easily, and these fractures can lead to permanent disability or even death. One of the things that people who have osteoporosis may experience is something called kyphosis. And this is where a person has a hunched posture due to spinal weakness. You may have seen some older adults who have this. Now, this is not always caused by osteoporosis. It can be caused by other things like infections like tuberculosis. Of course, that's been, we don't see many people who have that, but when we think about older adults, they may have had that earlier in their lives. Also, hormone diseases, connective tissue disorders, also birth defects, but a big contributor can be osteoporosis. So there are things that we can each do to maintain and to even improve our bone health. And some of these things we can do include eating a healthy diet where we get enough calcium and vitamin D, getting regular exercise, and limiting alcohol and not smoking. There are additional things that we can do that can be important. We might want to be careful about certain medications that we take. Some medications can have an effect on bone health, so it would be important for someone who already has osteoporosis to talk about this with their doctor. Also, if you're at risk for developing osteoporosis because of other health conditions, you'd want to be cautious about the medication that you're taking, again, because some medications can have an effect on bones. Some of these medications include steroids in particular, and some additional medications that are used to treat cancer and for gastric reflux. So it's important for people to be aware of the effects, potential effects of these medications. I want to point out alcohol and smoking. because these are important potential contributors to the development of osteoporosis. So alcohol consumption in particular, regularly consuming alcohol, and this would involve about 2 alcoholic drinks a day, seems to increase one's risk of developing osteoporosis. And I think this is an example of how important early choices that we make are when we think about the consequences later on. And this is because research suggests that chronic heavy alcohol use, especially during adolescence and the young adult years, can dramatically affect bone health and increase the risk of someone developing osteoporosis later in life. So really what we need to be thinking about is drinking less if we want to have strong bones later on. And of course, smoking can be very devastating to the bones. And this is because of how smoking produces free radicals. We talked about that when we talked about theories of aging, and also because of the effects smoking on hormones. So actually when someone's smoking, especially if they're smoking when they're menopausal, smoking is going to make already waning bone health much, much worse. That doesn't mean that a person is okay if they're smoking premenopause and then stops. You still can see the effects on hormones, even premenopausal, that can have an effect on bone health later on. Another health condition experienced by many in late adulthood is COPD, also known as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And this is a progressive lung disease where the airways become damaged and it can make it difficult for a person to breathe. This is a disease that develops slowly. There are many different causes potentially of COPD. One of the main causes is exposure to tobacco smoke. But in addition, air pollution can contribute to its development. Also, occupational exposure, where someone's exposed to intense, prolonged workplace dust, chemicals, and fumes. Genetics may play a role for some people. And as you note from your reading, this can, it's a recessive genetic condition of COPD is responsible for only about 1 in every several thousand cases. So it seems that the primary causes of COPD are behavioral and then environmental. Figure 920 in your textbook shows you the difference between the airways and air sacs among people who are healthy and among people who have COPD. So that with people who have COPD, their airways can become so swollen and thick and mucus production can increase, and this can then make it very difficult for the person to breathe. And again, this is a progressive condition, and so this means there's a gradual onset. Often though, when someone is diagnosed with COPD, they have had some symptoms already that they've experienced over time, but these may have been mildly developing, and then it reaches a point where it becomes distressing for the individual, and that's when they seek help or seek treatment. People in late adulthood are also at an increased risk of developing shingles. The phrase shingles may not sound very harmful, but actually it can be very harmful. It can be very painful. Shingles comes from the same virus that causes chickenpox, and what it does is it affects a single nerve, and then it creates a localized rash around that area. A localized rash may again sound harmless, but it actually can be extremely painful. And this is something that's not uncommon in late adulthood. Actually, several million people in the US experience shingles every year, and 1 in 3 adults will develop shingles in their lifetime. Now, the only way you can contract shingles is if you've had chickenpox. So if you've had chickenpox, you're at an increased risk of developing this. And there are vaccines that people take to prevent its onset. I think there are 2 different vaccines that are available for people to take. When people have shingles, not only do they experience intense pain, they can also experience a lot of itching. They can also have fluid-filled blisters. They can have fever. They can have headache, fatigue, chills, and stomach pain. They might also have some complications that could include hearing loss and a loss of taste. And it can also lead to some longer lasting conditions, even meningitis, inflammation of the spinal cord, and skin infections. I'm just naming a few of the potential long lasting conditions. So you can imagine when you read in your textbook that shingles can interfere with daily activities, why it can. So shingles can be very devastating for a person who gets them. And different people will experience different degrees of symptoms. So not everyone will have the exact same symptoms, but overall, it can be very serious, and it's important for people to consider getting vaccinated or to consider some other preventive measures that they can talk about with their doctor. As people move into late adulthood, they also experience some changes in brain functioning. I think it's important to point out that brain aging is inevitable to some extent, but it's not uniform for every single person. It affects everyone and every brain differently to some extent. But there are some overall general patterns that we see. But again, there also are some unique experiences or unique changes that individuals have. So what are these changes? Well, the brain loses about 5 to 10% of its weight between the ages of 20 and 90. And this is because of a shrinkage of neurons, a lower number of synapses, and a shorter length of axons. As you'll remember from earlier chapters, neurons are the building blocks of the nervous system. Synapses are what allow for communication between neurons, and then axons are what give the neuron its length, and that's where we see the traveling of the neural impulse. So we see changes in the axon as well. So some of the changes that we also experience include a change in white matter. So white matter, it consists of myelinated nerve fibers. If you'll remember, we talked about, or you learned about myelin. The myelin sheath is what's covering the axon. It speeds up the neural impulse. It helps to insulate the axon. And so researchers think that myelin shrinks as we get older. And so then as a result, processing can be slower and cognitive function can be reduced. Also, neurotransmitter systems can change. So some of the research suggests that the brain generates fewer chemical messengers with age, and it's the decrease in dopamine, which is a pleasure chemical, and some additional neurotransmitters like serotonin and acetylcholine, which is important for many things, including memory, that may play a role in declining cognition and memory, and an increase in the rate of depression among people who are in this age group. Also, the overall cortical density changes. And what we're talking about here is the thinning. There's a thinning of the outer ridge surface of the brain that happens because of declining synaptic connections. And these fewer connections may be contributing to slower cognitive processing. Overall, what we tend to see, the common memory changes that we'll be looking at here in just a little bit, that are associated with aging, and these are the normal changes that are happening, and many of which can be attributed to brain changes, can include some difficulty learning something new, committing new memory or committing new information to what we to our memory can take a bit longer for someone who's older. Multitasking can also be affected. There can be a slowed processing, which can make planning parallel tasks more difficult. Also, and some of you may already have these struggles too, recalling names and numbers. Well, this gets, for most people, as they get older, this becomes more difficult. It actually begins to decline the ability for us to do this as early as age 20. And then having just a memory for general things that we need to, general life events. So remembering appointments, for example. Older people may have more difficulty doing this without having some sort of cue to recall the information. So it's going to be important for older adults to have a calendar or someone who is reminding them of appointments. These are natural changes in aging that are related to memory. Within the past decade, researchers have come up with a theory called the scaffolding theory of cognitive aging. This theory suggests that the changes that occur as we age are part of the lifespan process, and that the brain can compensate by building alternative connections, which is called scaffolding. And it can do this in an attempt to alleviate the cognitive decline that's associated with aging. Now, interestingly, although there are many programs available online and through apps that claim to help people to compensate for brain changes, these brain training programs are not that effective. Instead, activity, social engagement, and learning new skills are better. So it's most ideal for older people to spend time with friends and family, learn new skills, and to be active within their community. Another particular health issue that can be experienced in late adulthood and is more commonly experienced in later adulthood than it is among younger people is Parkinson's disease. This is a disease that's most commonly diagnosed in people who are over the age of 60. Very few people are diagnosed with Parkinson's disease before the age of 50. And this is the second most common age-related nerve degenerating disease after Alzheimer's. So the biggest risk factor for Parkinson's disease is age. And the exact cause isn't fully known, but it's thought that it may be caused by a combination of genetic and environmental factors. So Parkinson's disease, as you read in your textbook, affects many different areas of the body and the brain. When someone has Parkinson's disease, they have a death of nerve cells in a brain region that's called the substantia nigra. And this is a part of the brain that's largely responsible for motor symptoms that someone has with Parkinson's disease. And these symptoms include tremor, rigidity, and a loss of spontaneous movement, poor coordination, a difficulty moving. And also, it seems that because dopamine is a chemical messenger that, as you've learned in earlier chapters, dopamine is important for pleasure, but it's also important for transmitting signals that produce smooth and purposeful movement. And so it's thought that the substantia nigra may have a loss of neurons in the brain that are related to dopamine. And so treatment for Parkinson's disease can involve then using drugs that increase dopamine levels. As people get older, their need for sleep also changes. Older adults need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. What you tend to see is a decline in the quality of sleep, and you can imagine why as we've looked at all of these physical changes that one experiences when we think about chronic conditions or pain that may decrease the quality of sleep. Then this can, of course, have an effect on daily function, which we know when someone's not getting adequate sleep that this can affect memory, it can affect mood, it can affect eating habits, and it can affect overall health in general. I think it's important too to note that there are circadian rhythm changes that people experience in late adulthood, and this is known to cause advanced sleep phase syndrome, where a person goes to bed earlier and then they get up earlier. Some of you who know people in this stage of life, you probably can recognize this sleep pattern. It's so important, like I just mentioned, for people to get good quality sleep. It's important for their physical health, for their safety, and their cognitive functioning. And as I mentioned, and as you can imagine from what we looked at in earlier health-related issues that people in late adulthood are more likely to experience, we can think about how sleep can be significantly affected. People in late adulthood are also more likely to experience sleep problems and sleep disorders, and these include insomnia, sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome, periodic limb movement disorder, and rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder. I want to point out too that oftentimes sleep issues can be due to medications that a person is taking. And one article that I read a couple of weeks ago suggested that almost 40% of adults who are over the age of 65 take 5 or more medications. And I think this is important for us to think about because many over-the-counter and prescription drugs can contribute to sleep issues. And then we can think about how those drugs interact with one another and how that interaction or those interactions might affect sleep quality or may lead to sleep disorders and sleep problems. So, what have you learned about? You learned about the rising number of individuals who are currently identified as late adults and the increase in late adulthood worldwide. And you were encouraged to think about both the economic and social implications of this. You also learned about the different ways that developmental psychologists describe aging and the difference between lifespan and life expectancy. You learned about the 3 age categories for late adulthood and the factors that contribute to becoming a centenarian. You also learned about the different theories of aging and the changes in physical appearance in late adulthood and why these changes happen. You learned about the sensory changes that happen during this stage and chronic health conditions during late adulthood, including cancer, hypertension, diabetes, and COPD. You learned about the importance of nutrition and exercise in late adulthood and the physical and functional changes in the brain during late adulthood and how the scaffolding theory of aging and cognition can be used to explain how our brain compensates through these changes and how social connections, learning new skills, and activity can help in this compensation process. You learned about Parkinson's disease and its symptoms and causes, and you learned about changes in sleep patterns in late adulthood and sleep disorders, including insomnia, sleep apnea, and REM sleep behavior disorder. What will you be learning about next? In our next video, you're going to be learning about the cognitive changes that occur during late adulthood. As always, as you read and after watching these videos, please don't hesitate to reach out to me with any questions you have. I look forward to seeing each of you online.